Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dan Flores, who is our guest today.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
It's so wonderful to have you. You're an author. The two books we're going to look at today are Coyote America and American Serengeti, but we'll talk about that in a minute. You write about cultural and environmental issues in the West. You were former Professor A.B. Hammond Chair in History of the West at University of Montana at Missoula.
That's correct.
And you have recently retired from that?
I have. I retired in 2014 after 36 years in the academic world and 22 years at the University of Montana. And so I came down to Santa Fe. And I'd built a house here about a decade ago. And so when I retired, I got a chance to move down here finally.
Right, to the land where you can hear coyotes out your back porch.
Absolutely.
You have won so many awards. Do you want to name a couple of them? Because the list is prodigious.
Well, I think probably two I'm proud of with respect to these two books are, and I didn't actually win this one, but it was the PEN America prizes or big national prizes.
It sure is.
Yeah, and so Coyote America finished as a shortlist finalist for the E.O. Wilson Prize in Literary Science Writing, and I'm proud of that one. And the other book, American Serengeti, won the Steubendeck Distinguished Book Prize for the best book about the history of, or actually about the Great Plains in any kind of venue in 2017.
So what you've done that's so extraordinary, you're a historian of place, and such an important aspect of place is a character in Western the literature of the Western United States. In Max Evans, the High-Low Country, Tony Hillerman, Navajo Country. You're in such good company that the Annie Proulx,
yeah.
It's a very hard name, but she called you one of the best historians of place. She compared you to Thoreau, Aldo Leopold, John Muir, and Peter Matheson. So let's look at some of this stuff. Okay, we're going to start with Coyote America.
Okay.
What a pleasure to read. The subtitle is A Natural and Supernatural History. It's the Wall Street Journal called it a masterful synthesis of scientific research and personal observation. So I want to start at the absolute basics. The word coyote, the name coyote, where does it come from?
Well, it has actually, our use of it has a New Mexico kind of angle, because that name, that word, is an Aztec name for the animal from the Nahuatl language. And when Americans first encountered these animals, at least outside the Southwest, when people like Lewis and Clark, for example, encountered them, they had never heard this Aztec name, and so they gave the coyote the name prairie wolf. And for a lot of the 19th century, that's what most Americans called coyotes. I even found the use of that name as late as 1916, where people were still using the name prairie wolf. But when Americans began coming to New Mexico and encountered Santa Feans in particular, in the 1840s and 1850s, they began encountering people who were using the old Aztec name, Hispanicized at that point to sound like coyote. And so for the first time, Americans heard this ancient name for the animal. And within a period of about 20 years, most Americans were calling these animals coyotes. And Mark Twain, in his famous book Roughing It in 1873, basically told us how to pronounce it, that it was a three-syllable name. It was coyote, although he was already translating it into coyote rather than coyote, and that's the way most Americans have used the name ever since.
Well, that's the evolution of the name, and we have like eons of biological history of this critter. If you could give us a short version of the natural history, because where did they come from? Where have they spread?
Oh, indeed. Well, the first thing you have to know about the coyote is that it's actually a small wolf. It's closely related enough to the wolves that it's able to hybridize with them and interbreed with them, which is something that's happening particularly in the east and the south as we speak. But these are animals whose evolutionary legacy goes back in the American Southwest, in fact, is where they evolved more than 5.3 million years ago. That's where the canid family came from. All the jackals, the wild dogs, the dingoes, in fact, all of our pets at home, all come from this evolution of the canid family out of the American West more than 5 million years ago. Many of them spread around the world. They follow the land bridges to places like Asia and Africa. But the coyote was one of the animals out of this line that never left North America. So it's about as an indigenous an animal as you can possibly get.
There are a lot of similarities in the adaptability of the coyote as a species and humans. You even call them, in a way, an avatar figure for us. So how are coyotes and humans alike, and how are they different?
Well, the differences, of course, are easy to see. They're four-legged mammals. We walk on on two legs. We come out of the primate family, which is an African family, and they come out of this canid family that's out of North America. But as I began doing the research for this book, one of the things that struck me, and this is the reason I use the term avatar, which in effect in the computing world means the stand-in for the person at the keyboard, is that they've functioned that way not only in cultural terms. It's why I think one of the reasons native people selected them as a deity is because they closely expressed human nature. But I think it's also true biologically because they share a lot of the same evolutionary adaptations that made both of us, both humans and coyotes, very successful species. And so part of our success, in fact, in spreading around the world and becoming so numerous and basically becoming a dominant animal on Earth is the fact that we share some of these evolutionary adaptations that coyotes also happened upon as these marvelous kinds of ways to survive in the world. And so they mirror us in a lot of ways.
And one of the traits you describe in a very unusual phrase, fission and fusion.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
Well, it basically is a term of art and biology that refers to animals, usually social animals, like the canids. I mean, dogs obviously are social. They often have packs. And we, too, are a social animal. We live in social groups. But what this refers to is an animal that is mostly a social animal, mostly lives in groups, but when circumstances require it, and that's been the case for both us and coyotes on a number of occasions in our long histories, we're able to do this fission thing. Mostly we're fusion animals, but we can be fission animals where, in the case of coyotes, if they're harassed, they'll break off into singles and pairs and sort of scatter across the landscape. And in human terms, what we've often used this kind of fission strategy to do in our past is to escape things like disease epidemics. Whenever big disease epidemics have swept across humanity and threatened to wipe us out, one of the ways we've survived is to do the same thing. We scatter as individuals and as pairs and as small groups to try to survive. Not very many animals do this. Wolves, for example, are pure fusion animals, and it was one of the reasons they were susceptible to us taking them out, in fact.
By always being in a pack.
By always
and
being
not
in a
just
pack. Yeah.
fleeing for survival.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we use the
Yeah.
term lone wolf in culture, but it almost never really applies to real wolves that are actually very committed pack animals.
There's you write so beautifully in Coyote America about the interactions between humans and coyotes, and most of it is pretty grim. It's a species side for sure. Talk a little about that, but then I would like you to read a short passage from your book about another kind of human-coyote interaction.
Sure.
But so what happened? Who wrote the PR for the coyote that they would be exterminated like the wolf? I mean, that was our human intention for how long?
Well, for at least 75 years, we actually fingered them for total extermination. And we did it, amazingly enough, before we ever did any science on them. So we didn't really know anything about what they even ate, what their natural history was. We just decided that in the wake of the near extinction of the gray wolf in America, that coyote was actually the prime predator, the arch predator of our time, as the government called them. And so starting in 1931, we made an effort actually to exterminate them, primarily using poison. And what's kind of remarkable about that, in addition to the fact that we do it without really knowing anything about them, is that it followed on this long 10,000-year history when these were sacred animals and were revered by native people all over the part of the country, which was the West, where they ranged. And suddenly this biography goes off in this crazy direction, this roller coaster ride, where the roller coaster begins to plummet downward as we Americans decide that we're going to wipe them off the face of the continent. And so we spend decades attempting to do it.
And it has to do with the Western expansion, because the native inhabitants of this part of the Southwest never felt that way. They felt the coyote trickster was a fascinating, revered figure.
Indeed.
But when the part of the Western expansion that came, when they decided to have this war on predators that continues to this day.
That's true.
Give me some of the figures. It's pretty staggering.
Well, we think after the invention of 3 new poisons during World War II and their application beginning in 1945, we think that between 1945 and 1972, when President Richard Nixon actually issued a presidential proclamation stopping the poisoning of coyotes on the public lands, that we probably poisoned about 6.5 million of them to death. I mean, we were spreading at times more than 3 million poison baits a year across the West. And of course, killing not just coyotes, but there was all sorts of collateral damage of all kinds of other
Birds,
species.
rodents,
Everything
everybody.
under the sun was being killed by the collateral damage. But the target was the coyote, and something like 6.5 million of them. And what's kind of remarkable about this, and the irony of it, is that the only thing that accomplishes is to send them into this fishing pattern where they go into colonization mode and spread out of the West and spread all across North America. So all our attempt to exterminate them accomplished was to spread them to every single state in the Union, Hawaii accepted.
We're speaking today with Dan Flores about his book, Coyote America. Not everyone felt that way, as we said earlier. Could you, first of all, maybe in words, summarize most of the passage that you were going to read, and then read us the part, set up the passage, and then read maybe just
a
half
small
a
piece
page.
of it?
Yeah.
Sure. So what I go to some pains to try to get people to recognize about this animal is that it's been stereotyped and branded with terms like arch predator of our time. And I mean, people in urban areas in Los Angeles referred to coyotes as gangbangers. I mean, we even use that sort of terminology. But what I've tried to get people to do is to see the animal for what it is and not what these stereotypes tell us. And so the story that people have often asked me to read from the book is about a story that a Navajo friend of mine, a boatman on the Grand Canyon, as I was descending the Grand Canyon a couple of years ago, this fellow named Marcus Buck was the baggage boatman, and after we went through Lava Falls Rapid, it was possible to ride on the baggage boat if we wanted to. And so one morning I rode with Marcus, and he had heard me a couple of evenings before sort of summarize. The book wasn't finished yet, but I had summarized for the group that was descending the Grand Canyon some of the points out of the book. And so Marcus told me his story. And what his story basically was about was having, in the little town of Bluff, Utah, where he lived, having a coyote come in and sort of become a problem. And so the Navajo chapter leadership asked Marcus if he would take care of this animal. And so Marcus got in his pickup truck, put his rifle in the gun rack, and he went sort of cruising around the neighborhood to see if he could find this coyote. And he does find it. And so I'll read you the part that sort of is the conclusion of the story. And this is what happens when Marcus finds this animal. This coyote walks nonchalantly right in front of me in the road, looks at me, sees the rifle. Then you know what he does? He yawns right in my face, kind of stretches. Then he turns to look back where he'd come from, and I hear coyotes howl a ways back. So he raises his nose, throws back his head, and howls back at them. I've got my hand on the stock of the rifle, but I still haven't pulled it down. Now he stops howling, turns back to me, looks straight as can be, right at me for probably half a minute. Then he strolls casually across the road in no hurry at all, as if he knew something about me. So you never shot, I said. I'd known how this was going to go. No, I never even got the gun down. He was just too damn nonchalant, too confident, something. And I didn't know for sure if it was the coyote everybody was looking for. But you know something? Even if it was, I wouldn't have shot. That coyote was so cool looking, so perfect. He was way too pretty to shoot. I nodded. Marcos had experienced one of those moments of sympathy with the world, much the way Adolph Murray had in Yellowstone so many decades before when he'd watched the coyote trotting along a trail, tossing a sprig of sagebrush into the air and catching it in its mouth again and again. These are moments of identification, animal to animal. They're rare. Sometimes a moment like that becomes unforgettable because the dialogue of body language isn't getting filtered by the cultural thoughts in our heads by loaded language like depraved or gangbanger or arch predator of our time. Each sees the other for who he really is. Although rare, those are the kinds of moments millions of us need to have so we can coexist with coyotes, urban and otherwise.
Oh, that is wonderful. It reminds me, didn't one of your reviewers in reviewing the book say that Coyote is the dude and the dude abides?
Yeah, he's actually quoting a line from the introduction of the book.
Yes.
Yeah, where I compare the coyote to the dude in The Big Lebowski.
Yeah. And
that's exactly what coyotes are.
Well, we're going to stay with Coyote because I am so enchanted. So we had this war on predators, and it continues to this day. You, further on in the book, talk about the image of the coyote now and the things that have swung the American perspective toward it.
Yes.
One of which is the Wile E. Coyote versus the Roadrunner series.
Indeed so.
And you did say that one of your favorite pieces was a New Yorker piece where someone has Coyote suing the Acme manufacturing company for all these diabolical things he tries to use that malfunction.
That's right. Yeah, that's Ian Fraser's story in the New Yorker. And so I think what has to happen for us to begin to recognize the folly of our ways in persecuting this indigenous animal that had been a sacred animal for so long is that we had to begin to see it in a different way. And I attribute popular culture to playing a pretty significant role in that. One of the things I talk about in the book is being a kid and watching Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color and seeing this marvelous pro-coyote film that Disney did in 1961. It was called The Coyote's Lament. And it was Disney's effort, he said, to tell the story of what happened to American expansion across the country from the coyotes' point of view rather than from the point of view of humans. And so that became the first of 6 films that Walt Disney did in the 60s and 70s on coyotes, which I think began to shift the zeitgeist in the country a little bit about how we looked at them. And then, of course, almost all of us came to count Wile E. Coyote as kind of this coyote friend who we saw on Saturday mornings in his endless pursuit of the Roadrunner. And of course, who can't identify with the kind of obsession that Wile E. Coyote has about this pursuit, the frustration of it, and ultimately the humiliation, because of course he never succeeds. And I think where Ian Fraser's story comes in is, as we all know from the Wile E. Coyote cartoons, Wile ultimately does this classic American thing of deciding that technology is the way to catch the Roadrunner. And so he calls on this fictitious corporation called the Acme Corporation to provide him with scores of different kinds of technology to catch the Roadrunner, every one of which, of course, backfires. They never succeed. And one of the roles that Wile kind of plays is that he, as Old Man Coyote in the Indian stories had done, he mirrors us at particular times. And so in the 70s and 80s and 90s, as we were becoming a little more savvy about lawyering up, Ian Fraser writes this story in the New Yorker where he has Coyote actually hire a lawyer and bring a product liability lawsuit against Acme for selling him all this useless technology that never did work. It's one of the funnier stories that New Yorker ever published.
You had said that it's kind of a Rorschach test for a whole set of values, that how people feel about, say, the coyote killing contests or the extermination of the wolf. You had the word, John Wayne was in there somewhere.
Yes, yeah.
If you knew how they felt about this one element, you knew how they felt about pretty much everything else. But we're in an age where these divisions so desperately need to be healed.
Indeed.
What does Coyote teach us?
Well, I think Coyote, if we know about the animal, and that's, of course, one of the purposes for writing this book, is everybody in America is suddenly grappling with coyotes trotting down the streets of their suburbs, trotting through their backyards. And so suddenly everyone in the country has this experience of having this small wolf in their presence. And yet, not just people in Manhattan or Boston for whom coyotes are brand new, but even people in the West, we don't know anything about them. And so my goal was to write a biography of this animal so that we weren't making these snap judgments or drawing stereotypical kind of views, but we actually knew something about where this animal came from and what it stood for. And so I think the goal clearly is coexistence, because the truth is we don't have any choice. We're not going to be able to do anything about them. We can't make them go away. They are so successful that they are in our presence whether we like it or not. And so we simply have to sort of suck it up and say, okay, we're going to coexist with them. I need to know about them, and I need to know how to do this. And I think that's the sort of conclusion we have to draw. In a lot of ways for Americans, that's kind of a universal conclusion. We have to do that about a lot of things, about having a multicultural country, for example. We have to just figure out how we're going to make this work.
How can we use what we learned about coyotes to rethink our relationship to nature as a whole?
Well, I think, as someone has said, if we can figure out how to respect coyotes, which have long been, without any just cause, denigrated and compared to cockroaches, to starlings, to tarantulas, to every kind of despicable animal out there. Again, without knowing the first thing about them. But if we can make the transition from taking an animal that we've denigrated this way and learn to respect it, then I think we're on the road to being able to do that for the natural world in general. I mean, and the coyote offers up this lesson, once again, of not jumping to conclusions. Spend some time learning about the science, the real science behind this particular animal. And once you do that, you're going to have a different impression of it. I don't think there's any question about that.
I am concerned that it reflects again the gap between urban and rural, and the ranchers have a real strong self-interest in exterminating any predator. And the people in the cities, now wasn't there a coyote riding a city bus in one city?
Oh yeah, there's a photograph in the book in Portland of a coyote that was chased off the Portland airport, and it hopped on a bus for downtown, and people who were getting on the bus noticed that they had a coyote as a seatmate.
It was just curled up on the seat.
Curled up on the seat, yeah, ready for the ride downtown.
Yeah.
I mean, we have them, there was one in a Quiznos sandwich shop in Chicago a few years that walked in during a heat wave and hopped up on a cooler in order to cool off. Of course, everybody in the store dashed out into the street and then turned around and looked through the windows at it. But they're everywhere. One was atop a bar in Queens 2 springs ago.
And why do you call it the American Avatar? Or an American Avatar?
An American Avatar. Because I don't know, and I write about animals. The other book I did, American Serengeti, is about a group of other animals in the American West. But I don't know an animal whose biography is as closely matched to our own as that of the coyote. And so that's why I think of it as an avatar, a stand-in the world for us. That's how those old man coyote stories function for Native people. The coyote was a stand-in for us, and his purpose was to teach people about human nature. That's what those stories are actually all about. They're not about the trick part of the stories. They're about why the tricks work. And the reason the tricks work is because of human nature.
Well, you have written a wonderful book. We'll talk about the other book soon. But I want to really thank you. Our guest today is Dan Flores. This book, Coyote America, A Natural and Supernatural History, is a marvelous read. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next time.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.